Our next panel, Sports and NFTs in the Next Gen Web. Here's Joanna Rindell, Senior Legal Counsel, Blockchain NFT for OneFootball. Chris Worsey, co-founder and CEO of SportsIcon.com. Dax Hansen from Perkins Coie, LLP. And Matt Marino, VP Sports and Lifestyle at OneOf.
All right, well, thanks, everybody. We're thrilled to be here. We have, I think, an interesting conversation for you today, and it's hopefully balanced. We have two business people, two lawyers. One of them is in-house, and one of them is at a law firm. So hopefully we're very well balanced. We're going to spend a few minutes today talking about some of the industry developments, just some of the business trends that we've had maybe since we were here last year, and where we're headed now. Touch on some of the regulatory issues, including those in the United States versus Europe in particular, because we've got European perspectives on this panel today. Hit some intellectual property topics in terms of considerations when you're doing NFT projects for different parties in the ecosystem. And lastly, some of the contractual considerations also when you're putting these deals together. So maybe to start with, why don't we throw it over maybe to Chris. Tell us what we think. Well, the topic here is sports in NFT sports in the next gen web, or Web 3. So maybe to tell us, like, what is Web 3 and what are metaverses, Chris? And maybe we could then just sort of riff off of your comments and let Joanna and
I think, to answer that question, I can tell you a little bit about what we're up to at Sports Icon. So I'm the founder and CEO. We're backed by people like Dapper Labs, by Naz, by Roham, by Chad Hurley. And essentially, there's three parts to the business. There's an NFT platform, SportsIcon.com. That's for athletes. Any athlete in the world can set up a profile and start minting NFTs directly onto the Flow blockchain. And then you've got the sports metaverse. We're building out the sports metaverse with about 10 brands at the moment. So essentially, we partner with them, build out metaverse experiences. And then the third part is Lion Club PFP. 9,000 NFTs sold out in about 10 hours. And our members get to connect with different athletes, such as Floyd Mayweather, Luis Figo, Baron Davis. So those are the three parts of it, and I think it just shows the three different options. So it's athletes sort of really connecting with their audience, metaverse, and also PFP.
Great. So Matt, maybe tell us what are we going to see in Web 3 with sports?
I think you're going to see a lot of different kind of projects and partnerships. I think one of the things that's definitely interesting to me, and as we get more and more aligned with partners like a OneFootball, or whether it's the brand side, athlete side, league side, federations, is how to structure them moving forward. What that looks like. Is that a DAO? Is that ownership? Does that replace the VP or the the VC and equity models that currently exist? Fractionalization. Obviously, if it's different individual athletes, who owns what the exclusivity is around a league compared to a team, how these teams and clubs structure their partnerships with different companies. Is there certain subdivisions within the kind of the exclusivity? Is it video, audio? What type of assets you're working with? So I think it's obviously a learning curve. Everyone's working on similar planes here, and as it gets built out and there is a little more structure and kind of parameters around it, we're all going to see it take some shape now as it has compared to about a year ago, and even beyond that, and then how it's going to look in probably a year, 2 or 3 years down the road. So those are the things I think are interesting for the future, and how we're kind of planning them at OneOf.
That's great. Joanna, give us a succinct definition of Web 3 and metaverse, at least your way of thinking about these. What does this mean?
So for me, Web3 and the metaverse, I think there's, first of all, a lot of aspects, of course, to it. But coming from OneFootball, from a sports company, for us, it's definitely mostly about gaming in the metaverse. So how can we now, when we're building our NFT platform, and partnering up with a lot of very interesting clubs and leagues out there, how are our users, like the football fans out there, going to utilize and use the NFTs that they purchase in the metaverse in the future?
That's great. I mean, I think about Web 1 being as the internet connecting us, Web 2 as us interacting with platforms like Facebook and Google and other platforms, and Web 3 is where the users are going to end up owning that infrastructure, or at least controlling a lot of the experience and bringing their assets in and out, which to me in this sports context means that we're going to have users that are able to bring in their digital assets, like their digital trading cards and uniforms and the other assets, and move them across different platforms. And of course, we're not seeing that full interoperability yet, but that's sort of the holy grail. I think from my perspective as a lawyer who's been helping people change the world in crypto for the last now dozen years, I thought that it was really interesting over the last 18 months to see that sports introduced the masses to crypto in ways that nothing else has, right? Like, to me, it was a lot of the crypto people, enthusiasts, all knew that it was really cool, but a lot of other people didn't quite understand it yet. When the Bitcoin price went way up, people got super interested. But when like the NBA Top Shots came out, and people could actually relate to it, like people can relate to trading cards, right? And then I think they're going upstream to think about, okay, well, what is a fan token, and then what are different stable coins, and what about other types of digital assets? So to me, one of the interesting questions to think about is how will the sports influencers, the leagues, the people who are building applications focused on the sports fandom in the community, how will they impact the user experience, the apps of crypto generally, things like wallets more generally. So good. Well, so let's transition for just a minute over to regulatory. So here in the United States, at least, so Joanna and I have been talking, in the United States, right now we're dealing with a lot of securities issues, right? That we don't have a lot of clarity on these issues, although we have some new bills that have been introduced into Congress. We have some litigation that's pending, the Ripple, the library cases, and some others, where we might get some clarity on this, where we could figure out how to deal with them. But do you want to tell us how NFT, well, and I guess the hope is, at least in the United States, that NFTs, as things like collectibles, are not securities. But I think it's a fair reading of the law to say that you can even make an NFT subject to U.S. securities law. But tell us, Joanna, what's the landscape in Europe?
So in Europe, we're also taking the same standpoint that NFTs are not yet securities, and we have some regulation coming up, such as the MiCA, so marketing crypto assets, and that one has also left out NFTs for the moment, so only focusing on fungible tokens crypto for the moment, and then we also see some other jurisdictions such as Liechtenstein and Switzerland that have also now started framing regulation around tokens, which I have to say is good, because also like Liechtenstein, for example, being a very good example at the moment, whereby you're trying to find ways to compartmentalize different types of tokens, and of course that gives more security for whomever operates in that space in general. So we hope to see more of it.
That's great. And maybe looping back real quick, Matt, I know one of the things you were talking about earlier was over lunch was inclusivity and the ability of more people to participate. I know that's not exactly a regulatory issue, but it is. These things are going mainstream, and there are sort of regulatory considerations. But tell us how you think about inclusivity and affordability.
Yeah, I think both of them, right? This has been a market or a product category it's been tough to break into. There are definitely barriers in it. One of the things that we've tried to do is break those down. Make it easy for people to understand, especially within the sports space. you're talking about fans that might not have the experience in crypto or with NFTs and be a little bit hesitant about making their first purchase or a number of purchases, right? So how do you knock that down? How do you, make it easier, right? And that's credit and debit cards, getting them, used to a crypto wallet, letting them play around in the space before you just throw that to them. Also, it's just the affordability, as you mentioned too. It's within sports, you're talking about people that come from a number of different backgrounds, and sports should always be a connector. It shouldn't keep people out. It should bring people together, whether it's a 15-year-old in Brazil, a 12-year-old in New York City, or someone over in the UK and Europe. That's what sports does. It connects different people from economic backgrounds, religions, races, and that's what you want to see on a platform, is that people can get in at a number, purchase an NFT at $2, $5, $10, and be part of that community, and not feel as though they're isolated when they can't make a purchase for $250. So I think that's something that's part of it. It's creating a community around it, and I think as we go, teams will understand the value of that. Teams in the States, teams in Europe, and then certainly you're talking about leagues who are trying to broaden their horizons, the NBA and obviously in Asia, and the investments they've made in Africa, European clubs and leagues, the investments they've made in the States. I think you'll see that, very seamlessly and work itself out in the future and bring new fans into the picture.
Sounds good. Chris, you work with athletes. Channel your inner athlete for a minute and tell us what are some athletes thinking about in terms of like their vetting of platforms? Like, did they think about regulatory compliance? Are they thinking only about their uses of their images? Or thinking about the revenue? Tell us that maybe sort of bleeding from sort of a regulatory topic into sort of an IP or rights consideration topic.
I mean, it really depends on who the athlete is. So we speak to some athletes who, quite honestly, are just looking for a paycheck. But you speak to some athletes who have got a vision for the type of NFT that they want to create, are really interested and are willing to give up their time, and those are the best athletes to work with. So an athlete who will, so what we do with some athletes is we create like a masterclass. So we get 2 days in the diary with them. First day, they tell their story. Second day, we get them on the training pitch. We break that down into NFTs, and then if you collect them all, you access loads of unique experiences. So it could be a Zoom call with them. It could be going to the training pitch with them. It could be getting signed merch. So that that's what we look for when we're vetting athletes. That people who get the space, people who want to connect with their fans in new ways, and then people who are really going to go on to the next level and put some time into it.
Yeah, great. Maybe just to round out some of the regulatory topics, just as a lawyer, wear my lawyer hat for a second, I'll say that a couple of things. One, even though a lot of these are internet-based protocols, NFTs and fan tokens and things are moving around, through the internet, there's a lot of regulatory friction at different borders, right? And things like fan tokens that are not securities and lawful in the United States, and they're not lawful here, are permitted outside the United States, and there's some clear categorization for those things. So there's still some friction sorting those things out here in the United States. And same thing for just the securities considerations. Many tokens are not viewed as securities in Asia and Europe, and they are in the U.S. and Canada. So there's just sort of an international focus you got to take if you're going to have these things float between jurisdictions. Maybe last thing on this topic, I do think that as we get more leagues and clubs and established, rights holders and broadcasters and other parties involved, that they are going to do more regulatory due diligence on the parties, but also thinking about the activities. And even just in terms of like a metaverse, to just figure out, if it's peer-to-peer and people are bringing their own assets in, or there's a lot of freedom and flexibility for the experiences, user-generated content people can build, are they bringing in things like unregulated gambling or securities or swaps or some sort of harmful content or hate speech or something else? And the content owners and I think some of the athletes themselves are also going to be focused on doing some of that due diligence. So it's expecting that will come and building some processes around that if you're building businesses. Okay, we're going to hit over to the topic of intellectual property. I know that all of you have thought about these issues, but maybe Joanna and Matt hit, and maybe you too, Chris, hit sort of the concept of exclusivity and rights clearance and enforcement. Maybe, Joanna, you take a first crack.
All right. Yeah, I think this is definitely when building NFTs in the sports space, something that we have come across quite a lot. And OneFootball, whereby it's a very interesting landscape where you have players have some rights, the leagues have some rights, the clubs have some rights, and then to try to understand who owns which rights, also which rights do you need actually to acquire when building an NFT. Also depending on the content, so do you put out a video, do you put out a player image, what is it that you want to achieve with it, and depending on it, you need to require different rights, and then plus the rights the rights to the content, you also have a designer's rights maybe, or the brand. I mean, if a player wears an Adidas jersey, what does Adidas own, and so on. So there's a lot of different aspects definitely that we have come across that we need to take into consideration.
Yeah, I think about exclusivity, Matt.
Yeah, I think one of the things I notice is that, whether it's working with athletes or teams, is trying to find different subsets, right? So it could be a video or audio, right? Talking to like a CBS or an NBC that owns audio, of historic matches, games, anything in the history, right? I think where it gets a little bit blurry is when you have teams that are looking for, multiple NFT partners or multiple blockchain partners in the space, and they want, 3 NFT partners and one to do, video, one to do audio, one to touch their historic, IP, their museum pieces, kits, things of that nature, right? It's trying to find that balance where the brand is, or the team is still getting value, the brand is still getting value, and then the community at large is supportive of it, because you don't want there to be them on 2 different blockchains. There's a lot of confusion of how it's promoted in the marketplace and how it's just promoted, what the optics are. So it's narrowing that scope down, and I think that's a conversation that people are getting educated on. Like we mentioned before, I think you'll start seeing a Web3 business unit for teams or for agencies representing players or for leagues, just like 10, 15 years ago when you started having a social media business unit that was responsible for that area. So I think it's something that everyone's getting up to speed on, but certainly a very blurry area when you're talking about whether it's through media or through just a partnership with a team that you're trying to carve that space out.
So one of the areas I think of the largest confusion that I've seen as a lawyer is just around what do people own when they buy these tokens, right? I mean, clearly they own the token and they can hold that in a wallet, and they got some private keys where they can move it, can be traced on the blockchain. But usually it's primarily a reference to a location where some other content is stored. And there's either it can be stored in a centralized location or a decentralized location. But often these things are subject to licenses, whether they're specified or not. And so I think we're going to still see a lot of need for clarity. I mean, maybe Chris, you can, maybe from your perspective, from the athletes, or maybe from just a platform perspective, how do you reconcile the fact that at least NFTs you got started with it being like a perpetual ownership right, unfettered ability to transfer it, with the fact that you've got, maybe in this case, an athlete who has some vested interest in their rights, or there's a players' union, a players' association, or a league that controls either a copyright, images of athletes, or trademarks and brands. How do you reconcile that?
Well, it's a bit of a minefield, to be honest. So, I think that's one of the things about working with individual athletes is, in fact, they haven't really got that much IP. It's all owned by somebody else. Certainly the last generation of athletes don't really own much of their IP. I think there's, the new modern athletes owning more image rights, owning more of their IP. So then Sports Icon as a platform, we've got a choice. Do we create content and create IP that way, or do we go and find different suppliers of IP and bring it all together? That's one of the reasons with the sports metaverse. We're on a big hunt for IP going straight to the IP holders, and maybe a big brand can come in and they've got like 20 brand ambassadors who are athletes, or maybe they've got content. So that's where we're taking the business now, more towards big IP, because as I say, it's quite shocking how little IP these athletes have actually got themselves.
Interesting. Maybe we could just ask the audience here, raise your hands if you've ever wondered what you own with the NFT, or what's being sold, or the standardization, or why there may be a disconnect between some terms from an issuer or a platform. Is everybody clear on these points, or people wish there was more clarity? I wish there was more clarity, and I view it as my job to help bring some clarity into the space so people at least know what they're buying, which usually means some sort of a licensed term. It gets into some commercialization. We talked about this, do people have the right just to display these things, use them privately, or can they commercialize them, right? And there isn't a one-size-fits-all. It's also, worth saying that NFTs don't have any sort of digital rights management tied into them, right? And so just because you own a one of one doesn't mean that you have the right to enforce against anybody necessarily. You've got to read the fine print. And there's differing laws, copyright laws, for instance, in the United States, or the ability, for sale document, be able to transfer them down to subsequent takers. But I will just say, from a legal perspective, and Joanna probably agrees with me, it's a real maze to figure out how you make contracts enforceable, how you make them transferable, and where people take subject to some sort of notice, and that we future-proof these so that when we're dealing with NFTs, 1,000 years from now, it's clear what the terms are from both the holder and the people who may have some underlying rights associated with it. Do you agree with that, Joanna?
Yeah, I would agree. I think definitely it's still work in progress for everybody in the field to kind of understand also, how do we govern, let's say, the leagues or like the underlying rights to the right holders. So if we think about an NFT, especially sports NFTs, where that would kind of, at least as it stands right now, it will not be transferred into an ape where the holder actually can own and commercialize the NFT that you would have. It's rather an NFT that you can sell or exchange or do something else with. So just to kind of, it's definitely, still a contractual thing to figure out, like how do we display, how do we make sure that the underlying rights holders' rights still are not infringed? How do we, make sure that the minter or the company minting the NFT also can still claim their rights and manage their rights and so on. So it's definitely like a lot of layers to figure out there. And of course, it's also difficult because, sure, there are some metadata that you can put into a smart contract, but a lot of things still needs to go into good terms and conditions. And as we were also discussing there over lunch, well, the terms and conditions are there on the primary marketplace, but then as the NFT moves along, on secondary markets and so on, they might be much harder to enforce at the end.
Yeah, so maybe just a plug to people working on user interfaces and smart contracts to allow for a field, a more defined field for legal terms in the metadata that goes along with the smart contract. They can then be presented maybe in a more uniform way on secondary platforms. Okay, so from a contractual perspective, that's kind of the user, like what does the user get? But from a commercial perspective, all of you are doing deals with athletes, with exchanges, with platforms, with minting platforms. Maybe just give us a few quick thoughts on things to consider when you're approaching those contracts. Maybe we'll go down the road here, Matt.
We've kind of hit on it. Is what is how you're planning for the future with the contract. How do you have to adjust and pivot, whether it's down the road, whether that's a team. If a team is relegated, if a team is promoted, how that adds to the kind of the scenario. If it's an athlete that, like Joanna mentioned, is an Adidas athlete and moves from team to team, no longer with that, the IP is somehow linked. Like, how is that kind of talked about, or how is it structured for the future? One, to protect, ourselves as a company, and one, to protect the athlete. And, separate that out so it's all coordinated and all structured so it can move seamless as the athlete's career or as that team, moves on down the road.
You mentioned something about strategy over lunch. Tell us a thought on the strategy guiding the contracting exercise.
Yeah, I would think about it as, or advise maybe also anyone who thinks about building an NFT collection to think about what's the end goal. So who do you want to sell to? What is it that you want to build? Which are the partners that you then need to get on board to actually build whatever it is that you want to build, and then consider which rights do you acquire for yourself, which rights might then be with somebody else, because ultimately you want to make sure that if you are the one, for example, minting the NFT, distributing it, that you can also control as much of it as possible so that you don't end up with some contributors that you didn't think would have contractual rights to the NFT, essentially having contractual rights to the NFTs at the end because you didn't think about all of the aspects.
Great. Chris, you get the last word. We're at time.
I think, I can talk about it from a commercial perspective. With athletes, we usually ask for 2 years of exclusive, and we, really go deep on what IP they've got. With brands for the sportsmetaverse.co, we usually look for a multi-year deal.
Great. And for those who are interested, Perkins Coie just released a paper called Fundamentals of NFTs that you can find at the Perkins Coie website for future fun legal reading. And just want to thank our panelists and thank the conference for hosting us. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.